Just to let you know, we're just about to start the recording and then we'll start. Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you for already being an incredibly lively group on the chat box. Let me get a few housekeeping points out of the way before we begin. Good evening. I hope you're all having a lovely evening so far. Thank you for joining me at 8 o'clock. I'm aware you might be in the middle of your supper or watching TV, hopefully not watching TV, hopefully immersed in this experience. And I'm aware for some of you this may be your very first webinar or it may be your 50th. So bear with me if it's the latter. My name is Laura Brammer and I'm a senior careers consultant who has worked with the Association of Optometrists and is looking forward to delivering this webinar with you, looking at successfully managing stress. We're going to be together for the next hour. Just a few housekeeping points about the webinar and how we're going to manage it. We've got a large group, there's about 100 of you, and obviously I'd like to make this as interactive as possible, but to stop it being a complete cacophony, then it's a couple of things. The main reason and the main means by which you can communicate with me, as you've already started to do anyway, is through the chat box. So I'll try to intersperse as many activities as possible. And when I ask for your ideas and your thoughts, you can just type your suggestions or ideas in the chat box, as you've all been saying hi and hello, which is great. If you want to communicate in a different way, if you look at the top of your screen, hopefully you can see a little figure with a raised hand. And if you click on that, you can indicate to me if you want me to speak louder or softly, or whether you find my jokes absolutely hilarious. You can even indicate that as well. It's never happened yet, but I live in hope. Anyway, and just to be aware, you will also be able to get a copy of these slides through the AOP website, I believe, afterwards. So feel free to scribble things down, but hopefully you'll also be engaged with the event. And I'm very much aware, you know, saying that we're going to successfully manage stress in an hour on a Thursday night is a tall order, but I believe in being as ambitious as possible. But in all seriousness, I want this to be a practically useful session to you. But at the same time, I've got my ideas about what I think would be helpful, but it's really important to listen to you to get a sense of what it is you want to get out of this session. So what has made you give up an hour of your Thursday night to attend this webinar? What do you hope to get out of this session? And you can tell me your ideas and everyone else in the chat box. As you can probably see, whatever you write in the chat box, all of us can see. So it's a shared space. So clearly, don't share anything in the chat box that you'd rather not be seen on the kind of the group screen, so to speak. So I mean, I've got some ideas, but what would you like to get at? Qualified staff? Well, quite right, Lloyd. I should hope so. I can assure you, I'm very experienced and very unstressed. But yes, certainly. So someone who knows what they're talking about. Matt talks about wanting to be chilled. Excellent. Don't we all? So to hear that others feel the stress I do. Awkward Ninja, thank you very much. I think this is really important. Part of this is sharing experiences and learning other strategies from each other, and also reassurance. Kate's talking about busy family life, toddler and a 6-month-old, so very stressed. GM, I'd like to feel less stressed and more confident. Probably most of us here are already stressed. I think Foxy, Roxy, I feel like a tea time DJ with all these names. It's great. So, you know, and I think it's worth saying, and Foxy Roxy's made an important point about, you know, are our bosses on here too? Clearly there's a sense that, you know, we've got a huge number with us and there are going to be people in different levels of responsibility. Some of you may have management responsibilities. So I'm hoping wherever you are within the organization, whether you're working within, you know, within a small high street practice, so to speak, or we're working in a different kind of setting, then hopefully it will be useful to you. Okay, great. Well, a couple of you have already made references to some of the things we're going to look at, so that bodes very well. So let's crack on and talk about some of the stuff we're going to look at. I know this looks a lot, but I believe we can do this. Essentially, I wanted to give you a chance to share your experiences, as you've already started to do, and address the common causes and manifestations of stress. And I'm not just talking about common causes generally, as in kind of professional adults, but specifically within your field. What are some of the pressure points that optometrists are feeling, particularly at the moment? recognize your stress drivers, which is kind of what Yvonne's been mentioning there, a reaction to stress, and looking at those response patterns, and ask yourself, which of the sort of stress triggers in your professional life can you control, which can you influence, and which can you do neither and therefore have to accept, and how might you go about it? In a lot of the one-to-one work I do as a careers consultant, when people come to see me either about changing their career or adapting their job in some way, one of the biggest causes of stress is, to be blunt, other people in their professional landscape. So I wanted to spend some time addressing how can we all cope with that better. I also feel we can't talk about stress without talking about time management, because that's a key ingredient and often what people feel most kind of despondent about, that they've been asked to do more with less time. And then I wanted to round off on the sense of, well, active strategies to improve your well-being. I think someone mentioned earlier, feeling awful when they go to work, feeling worse when they leave work, which is an unsustainable state. And I hope to end with some necessary changes, so you feel that you're ending tonight with practical things you can do to change the scenario that you're facing. Does all that sound about right? I'm hoping across the land, AOP members are nodding vigorously. Okay. So first thing is, essentially, I want you to think about understanding stress as a key way of managing it, because it's something that's in common parlance. We all know what we mean. Thank you, Bernadette. But, actually, what is it? Well, it's basically a situation where you just feel that the demands are greater than your resources, the resources that you have and the resources that the people have around you. And this is one of the more exciting slides, so I hope you enjoy it. So there's a sense of, increasing external pressures. And if I just ask you to think back across your work for the last month or 3 months or 6 months, maybe that's part of it, is a sense that the external pressures are growing and increasing at a pace that you feel is unsustainable. And equally, your reactions to those external pressures, it may well be that you're reacting in a way that isn't the way that you would like to react, that you're becoming more emotional in your reactions, or you feel that your fuse is getting shorter, or you feel that you have less opportunity to get support. And Ian said here, staff shortage due to illness. So the classic example of, something's happened in the workplace which has exacerbated what may already be a stressful situation. So these are some of the things that are driving stress, and we'll look in more detail in terms of your own field in a second. But these are some of the common signs of stress, and I just want you to look at these and think, well, which of these are you already kind of seeing in yourself, or seeing in your colleagues, or seeing in your boss, or those who work with you and for you? And which can you imagine, aren't that far away? We've got difficulties with sleeping. Our relationship with food changes, whether we don't eat enough or we eat too much. The way we do our job begins to dip, and that's often a result of things like your concentration is harder to focus on. You remember things less successfully. You start making uncharacteristic errors and start missing deadlines, and all of these things, and I can see many of you are recognizing quite a few of them, can lead to kind of emotional outbursts, partly because you can't cope with the kind of fallout of some of this stuff, increased nervous habits, and at the extreme end, turning to other kind of props to get us through the time. Okay, so I can see that many of you are saying there's quite a lot. We're all a bunch of worrywarts. Well, I'm sure there's some truth in that, but at the same time, I think that sense of it's a kind of self-perpetuating situation. Once you're aware of these signs of stress, it almost begins to feel that it's increasing constantly. I think at the same time, though, it's not about absolutely eradicating every element of stress in our workplace. I mean, there's kind of been loads of literature. I mean, my background's in sort of organizational psychology, organizational behavior, and there is an argument that a workplace with absolutely no stress whatsoever is unbearable in different ways. This idea of rusting out rather than burning out. So it's about this balance between the necessary resources that we all need to do our jobs, whether it's the time or energy. This sense of resilience, emotional resilience, is really important, and how resilient you feel going forward in your job, balanced against the demands, and those demands may be in terms of the complexity of the work that you're doing, which is obviously particularly key within your professional field, the challenge, the level of expectations, both from the patients you're working with, but also with the managers and the kind of organizational structures that you work in. And getting that balance in the middle is absolutely key. And without that balance, without that, there's a sense of dissonance, there's a sense of mismatch. And that's one of the reasons why we end up feeling so stressed at work as we often do. Okay, so you've already kind of been sharing this as we started, which is what I'd expect with such a large group, and that's great. And I'm hoping reading the chat box as you're listening to me, you're beginning to realize that you're not alone in some of this. I mean, I can see that many of you are agreeing with Parallel, for example, about management is the cause of stress rather than patients. But now I'm going to ask you directly, what are the main causes of stress for you as an optometrist? So in your daily sort of, might have even been today, maybe you had a particularly tough day today. What were some of the things that were the triggers? So time pressures is obviously something that seems particularly key. I can see that, lots of you are sharing not enough time. Demands from patients versus demands for a conversion to sales, says Plain Jane. So there's a sense of commercial factors that are also exacerbating. And that can see him as, greed, as JC says. Patients not valuing us, says Ed. So that's interesting. So the sense of not being appreciated for the work that you do. Management doubt, says Holly, understaffed continually. So this constant sense of running to keep up with yourself. So I hope what you're getting is a sense that whatever you're going through is shared. Appointment diary planning for emergency eye care when you can't foresee who will attend. Teresa says not having time to do what we need to do professionally. Incompetent managers make my clinics always run late. Holly's talking fields not done. So I'm imagining there's a sense of not delivering the quality of the service, or the quality or sharing your expertise as thoroughly as you know you'd like to, and feeling that people are getting shortchanged in the amount of attention that you can give. So pieces of equipment not working, and Stephen's sense of fear of missing something, and I think this is key. I also work with other forms of clinicians. We do work with a BMA, for example, and this sense of the culture of kind of litigation culture to some extent, and people having to deal with that constant sense of someone's going to kind of accuse me of making a mistake, and how wearing that can be, and how, yeah, Phil talks here about fear of litigation. Okay, well, obviously I'm aware we need to deal with this. We could spend all evening as listing causes of stress, but that's helpful in some ways, because this is some of the topics I came up with, partly based on one-to-one work I've done, and partly based in thinking about some of the factors that are driving some of the experiences in your workplace. And I hope you can see that these are reflected in what you said, this constant time pressure, demands on testing time. We've talked about the conversion to sale issue, the hours. I don't know if many people have mentioned feelings of isolation. Is that something that sort of resonates with any of you? Difficult patients who perhaps expect something for nothing and don't appreciate you, like you've said. Colleagues who are, equally shattered. Unrealistic expectations by patients, non-clinical staff and managers. This litigation sense we've already talked about. I'm aware of the Honey Rose case, etc. Lack of support. Elizabeth says, I like isolation after talking to patients all day. Well, yes, I do appreciate that as well. Unpredictability, so the sense that you're at the mercies of organizational changes within the NHS, for example, which are much greater than things that you can control. There's quite a lot of evidence in the literature in this field that says, people with high levels of job satisfaction, often people who also associates quite high levels of control in their job. They can feel they can control the elements of their day, and if that goes, or if that feels threatened, that can lead to sort of severe stress as well. And also, there's physical factors, but there's also personal factors. There's the rest of our lives. So obviously, if things are going badly at work, it may well be that they're also not going particularly well at home either, and one can obviously precipitate change in the other. Just out of interest, how has that been, sharing your causes of stress with each other? And this isn't a question I've built in, but I'm curious to get a sense from you. Yeah, a relief, cathartic, helpful, great. That's really good to hear. So I think there's a sense again of not needing to know that this is a shared issue. And I'm not suggesting that, well, that's all great. As long as you're all equally miserable, then there's nothing to worry about. I know that's not the point of this. But I think it is important to remind yourself support is available, and there's support from each other as well as, sort of suffering in silence. So external pressures. So again, this is just to go into a bit more depth. And the reason I'm laboring helping you identify what's causing stress is because I think it's really important that the more specific you can be about what it is, the more chance you have of dealing with it and coming to terms with it and making changes. So demands, workload patterns, control I've talked about, the sense of not enough support, the systems not working, the IT letting you down, the equipment, buggering up so you can't get on with the job as well as you need to. I think relationships are a huge part as well, because if you work in a context where you feel people are sharing your experiences, then you're more likely to feel that you can cope with them. And also, I think it's worth thinking about change generally, and change can be a huge cause of stress. I mean, that's why the change management industry is as vast as it is. So I think that's important. Okay, right. Let's also look about our internal reactions, because to some extent, if they're things we can't control to a large extent because they're other kind of systemic factors, then what affects how we respond? Well, we all have our own stress drivers. So we all have elements that are going to make us respond in a way that may not affect other people in the same way. And that's also linked to self-belief, to self-efficacy, to think about to what extent am I capable of having an impact on my own levels of stress, or am I just a sort of passive receiver of this? And this links to a sense of, agency, or, your pessimism, of your optimism. And also, I think it's a sense of literal resilience, your emotional resilience, but also your physical resilience as well. And that's obviously why stress can have a demoralizing effect physically, because the body kind of, has to absorb much of this. I could see there's a great chat going along here. Perhaps the AOP can take this on board and work on ways they can provide members with more support. So yes, I think this idea of this being a kind of learning exercise for the association as well will be useful too. Okay, I was in two minds about whether to share this, but I decided to go for it because there's quite a lot of work looking about whether clinicians generally are more prone to stress because of certain characteristics that are one of the reasons why they're successful as clinicians, optometrists. So, they tend to be high achievers, so the need for control is reasonably high. They tend to be perfectionists, which is what we all want them to be, because obviously they're dealing in a clinical sense. They tend to be emotionally sensitive, because part of the driver to make them work in a clinical sense is their compassion, their empathy. And they've also got an invested identity. It's about status. It's about responsibility. It's interesting, the chats that have been going on about how people are treating you as kind of, just service providers as opposed to professionals. What do you think? Do you think there's any validity in this? Foxy Roxy says you might recognize these attributes. Do dentists get stressed? I can say from working with dentists that yes, they do. So yeah, people seem to be saying that they agree with this. And again, I just think it's useful to look at this. It's looking at yourself through a different lens. It's not excusing the situation, but it's hopefully helping you to think, well, maybe that's why I respond in the way that I do, or part of it. Okay, right. Now, I now want to look at these 5 common stress drivers. So these are the kind of things we tell ourselves that can exacerbate our stress. I'm not suggesting that these are the only things. Many of you are talking about, things like patient woes and reducing salaries, like the kind of core aspects of what your experience is at work. But this is to try and help you understand about the way you're responding. So for some of us, it's this sense of wanting to be perfect. And one of the reasons we get stressed is we say, well, I can't start on that until I finish this and it's perfectly done. And obviously there are clinical reasons why that's absolutely the case in your work. I'm not suggesting you should be lackadaisical about this, but still, this is a common one. Another one is the sense of hurrying up. You know, if I can just do more, if I can just squeeze that in. Another one is wanting to please other people, and therefore we often find ourselves agreeing to take things on when we can't do that, and saying yes when really we need to say no. And then for some of us, it's more about wanting to demonstrate our independence and our strength. You know, I have to cope on my own. I've always coped on my own so far. I must be able to do this. I don't need to ask for help. And that links to this sense of trying hard. You know, the sense of, you know, it's got to be hard work. I need to make an effort. I'm never going to stop making an effort. I need to just put more of myself into it. Okay, so some of you have been kind of resonating with others, some of you with all of them, some of you with less, not all of them, fewer number than all of them. But just out of interest, and we've got an interactive poll now, everyone. Just when you thought this webinar couldn't get any more exciting, we're now going to see if the technology is as good as it's cracked up to be. So we're going to launch this poll, and which we're going to do in just a moment. We're going to move that over into the center of the screen. And I'm going to ask you to tick or choose which one do you think is your main stress driver. And, you know, so this is the one that you feel is the one that crops up most in your head. It may be that none of them do. And if so, fair enough. But I'm just interested to see, because we've got quite a large group here. We've got nearly 100 people. And, you know, I imagine not all of you are going to want to, you know, engage with the poll. You may just enjoy listening. But I just thought it would be interesting to see whether this cohort has a particular bias towards one than the other. Now, there's quite a bit of movement still. I'll just give it a couple of more moments just to see if it settles out. Okay, well, it seems to be that hurry up, this idea of, you know, I just need to finish, I just need to sort of squeeze more in, seems to be sort of heading in the right direction. And then being perfect is another one, pleasing others to a lesser extent. So there is a sense that some of these internal narratives kind of resonate with you more than others. So that's useful to know anyway, I think. Okay, great. We shall end the poll and move it back out of the way. And let's see whether that's possible. Great. Okay. Yeah, hurry up for me is the stress to make sure I run to time, says Plain Jane. Yeah, absolutely. That sense of, you know, it's only going to be worse if I don't keep up the pace. Okay, so that's great, but so what, so to speak? And I suppose this is a so what. This is some of the things that might help in that situation. So if be perfect was the main kind of stress driver for you, one strategy to use is try to identify what you can't change and accept that reality before you start the task. And this links to what we're going to look at in a bit, which is control, influence, and accept. So reconciling that, you know, you can't do that until these things are in place may not necessarily be a realistic response. So addressing that as much as you can. If you are someone who tends to want to please, you know, I wish I hadn't said that yes, then, you know, dealing with overload by clarifying your terms. I would do that, but this needs to happen. I would do that if such and such happens. I would do that when X and Y happens. So trying to set some parameters. Being strong, I have to cope on my own. Well, share your strengths by looking for opportunities to collaborate with others. I mean, to some extent, this is a kind of, oh no, I've just seen that Martin's poll didn't work on his iPad. I'm stressed. I'm terribly sorry. We'll look into that, Martin. Remain calm. So, you know, this sense of you're almost collaborating now. You're kind of, you know, you're supporting one another by hearing others' experiences. Trying hard. Think about your energy management. You know, are you putting the right amount of effort into the right tasks? Is it maybe you need to refocus slightly? And this hurrying up, which I know as it turned out was quite a popular one with this group. There's quite a lot of stuff around identifying your last responsible minute threshold. So what's the last time you can do something well before quality is lost? And I know that's probably quite an acute point for many of you who are working in extreme time pressures. And these are some of the kind of stress responses, or the responses that we see to stress. And again, I'd be interested to see which ones of these you kind of recognize. Sometimes we move into placating, you know, which could be anything from avoiding the problem just trying to keep people happy, keeping up appearances. And again, that might work for so long, but it's not always sustainable. And then another way of approaching stress is we blame. We may blame ourselves. We may feel isolated and blame other people. We may complain other people who we directly work with, or bigger sort of factors at play. We may withdraw, and this sense of analysis paralysis. I don't know if you're familiar with this, where you kind of, I can't do anything because it's too big. Where do I start? It's kind of, never ending. And then the final one, which I kind of suppose is physically the most deteriorating to some extent, is just panicking, flitting from one action to another, just got to make it through the end of the day, hopefully tomorrow will be better. And these kind of responses are driven by what's increasingly being seen as internal narratives. There's been quite a lot of work around this. Lloyd says blaming all the time. Lydia's talking about palpitations. Yes, so literally the body saying, I can't cope with this. So I don't know if you're familiar with the work of the fantastically named Eureka, but this is all about internal narratives. These are the things we say to ourselves when things are going wrong. And again, I haven't done this as a poll, but I was just curious to see if any of these kind of you think, yeah, this is actually what I'm doing. This is what I'm saying to myself. Rather than addressing things I can do, I'm letting myself fall into some of these traps. Externalize self-worth. I'm only good if others tell me I'm good. So this sense of needing feedback. And I think that's a fine line. We do need feedback. All of us as professionals need feedback. We all need to know to a greater or lesser extent that we're on the right track. Without that feedback, we can sometimes lose confidence in ourselves. But that overemphasis on what other people are telling you, this sort of fortune telling element, sometimes linked to sort of doomsday behavior. Well, I know it's going to happen. I can see it's going to happen. There's no point I do anything because it's just going to happen anyway. Magnification. It's going to be a disaster. It's going to be sort of end of the world, so to speak. Labeling. I'm so pathetic. He's so obnoxious. He's useful. She's a problem. She's a disaster. We've talked about perfectionism, comparison to other people, particularly if I think it seems other people are coping, and hopefully, the chat box itself is showing you that, other people are experiencing these on quite a broad scale as well. Emotional reasoning, I feel it, so I must be incompetent. A couple of you already said arbitrary inference. She did it because she hates me, or she did it because it's always the problem. Minimization. So when things go well, when good days do happen, oh, well, that was just a fluke. Well, that was because this was happening. And so underestimating when there's an opportunity to see some sort of light at the end of the tunnel. And mind reading. I know why people think that. So people seemed to have connected with those to different extents. So I hope that's helpful. And again, this is just thinking, well, this is what I'm saying to myself. I need to unpick some of these to some extent. So what are some of the ways we can manage this? Because I think up to this point, and Rachel says, I'm so glad it's not just me feeling like this. Well, yeah, I mean, I think this is really important, isn't it? It's that sense of don't suffer in silence. What you're going through is it's a broad issue, and there are strategies that we can apply in different settings. So be aware of the early warning signs and get to know your triggers. And whilst we may want to get rid of the source of stress, as Joe Bloggs suggests, realistically that just may not be possible. So we need to think about how are we going to manage these internal reactions and narratives. Remind yourself of your core values and strengths. Why are you in this job? Why did you come into it in the first place? What did you want to achieve in it? Why are you still working in it now? And it's quite an important activity to kind of reconnect with what's important to you, and commit to this idea of positive actions. I have got a choice. I'm choosing to remain in this situation in terms of I'm choosing to remain in this job. So how can I make sure that I support myself as best as possible? And being your own devil's advocate. And what I mean by that is questioning what it is that are some of the issues that you're facing from the other perspective. So not like this is why it's bad. Well, what can I do? What steps can I take to improve it? And a big strategy that I really recommend you explore is think about, well, what are your options for managing external pressures? And this is linked to control, influence, and adapt or accept. So I want you to think about, of the things that are causing you stress in your job this week, this day, are there any that you can control? Are there some that you can't entirely control, but you can nevertheless influence? And are there things that actually you cannot control, you cannot influence, and therefore you have to accept? And I think the reason I want you to think about this is it helps put you in the driving seat with all of these aspects to some extent. So I want you to think about something in your own situation. What specifically which category would you put it in? And I know that you've kind of been discussing this alongside as we've been going. If you can influence it and if you can control it, then what's stopping you? And it may be that it's fear that's stopping you. It may be that you feel you're the only one who feels like this. It may be because there'll be understandable anxieties about the impact of raising it as an issue. And if you can't do either of those things, what needs to change for you to accept it? Because you can't control it and you can't change it, but you can control at least your response to it. Right, let's have a think about what people have said to this. Okay, so lots of people are saying CB. Sorry, CB, I might have missed your comments. Let me see if I can scroll up and see. Sadly, I would change professionally if I could decide what to do, and fear the new job would be just as stressful as work. Okay, and lots of you are saying that you agree. Fear of changing is a problem. Yeah, I think fear, absolutely. Fear of change is a problem, and you'd expect me to say as a careers consultant. I mean, a lot of the work I do is people who want to see some change in their work experience, and sometimes that change is as full on as changing their profession. But I have to say, a lot of the people who come to see me ostensibly because they want to change their profession entirely, actually, when we unpick it and when we talk about it, there's sometimes still a real sort of seed of the job that they still like and they're still attracted to, and they can still see why they've remained in it for as long as they have. And actually, they don't want to just run away from that job. They want to run towards it. They want to run towards another job, so to speak. So they want to identify what it is they're looking for before they leave the situation that they're in, if you see what I mean. And so it's making time to really unpick what are some of the things that are pushing you towards the door and what are some of the things that are pulling you back at the same time. Nikki says locums can't make any changes, and yeah, that's a fair point. But again, it's thinking about, well, how can you influence the things that you can do in your practice as a locum that are maybe going to reduce your sort of stress levels. Pearl says lack of time to test properly, same time as years ago, but more expected with the eye test. So having more time per test would reduce stress. Okay. And how can we accept the stressful thing? How do you do it? Well, GM, I suppose what I'm saying is it's accepting that that thing is something you can't change, but it's thinking, well, what am I finding particularly stressful about it? Have I articulated that? Have I spoken to people within my work so they know that I feel the way I do? And therefore, there's a sense that, I'm suggesting there are going to be factors in your job that are beyond your control, but your response to it is hopefully something you can see you maybe have a bit more leeway to adapt to. Okay, right. Now, I think this will hopefully link to some of the things that have already been said. And this is about difficult people. How many of you, and again, this isn't a poll, how many of you would say you work with difficult people? Or let me ask a clearer question. How many of you find the management you work with more difficult than the patients you work with? Just out of interest. And again, I'm very much aware that we've got lots of managers who are probably on this webinar as well. So these are senior managers as well. Okay, so quite a few people seem to be saying yes. Okay, there's always this slight delay which says multiple attendees. Depends on the manager. Some are good, absolutely. And for certainly those of us who've ever been a manager, then that's it's not always as straightforward either. Okay, how many of you would actually say, no, the difficult people part of my job is definitely the patients? Any sense around that? So, okay, so occasionally, definitely, patients are a problem. No, more the patients. Right, okay, so we've got a real mix. Okay, well, what I want you to do while we go through this section, I want you to think about someone you find difficult at work, okay? Because I think it'll just make more sense if you've got someone in mind. So all of you don't have to, don't reveal any names. I like to just think they're somewhere, you're thinking about them. Now, rather than thinking about them as difficult, and bear with me, because I know this is difficult to do if there's someone you find particularly difficult, instead of thinking about them as being difficult, let's reframe them as people whose behavior has an impact on you that you find difficult to cope with. So the difficulty actually sits with you. So instead of asking, why are they difficult? Why is this person difficult? Try asking, and I know it might feel uncomfortable at first, but bear with me. Why am I having difficulty with this person? Joe, I'm absolutely on your side. So let's take this a little bit further. When we say they're difficult, what do they mean? What do we mean by that? And of course, I know it really varies. And, you may look at this list of difficult behavior and think, yeah, that sounds like a pretty average week. Hopefully you don't. But, sometimes we think about people who are aggressive or overbearing. Sometimes it's people who just don't have any response at all, people who are erratic and unreliable, critical, pessimists, very anxious. Working with incredibly anxious people can be difficult in itself. People who might seem insensitive or selfish, dominant, or people who are very demanding or needy. So these are some of the things we mean in practice when we talk about people being difficult. So how about if instead we think, well, actually, what about if I reframe that as which of my needs are they violating by their behavior? So if I'm working with someone who's aggressive, the reason I find that difficult and challenging is my need for security and my need to feel calm at work and not, in fear of someone losing the plot at any moment. If someone's really inattentive and doesn't seem to be connecting with me, that's because I quite rightly demand and need some attention. If someone's unreliable, that really challenges my need to feel I need to know what I'm doing and where I'm going and we're on a clear plan. And if someone's really critical and they're finding fault in everything I do, well, maybe that's really challenging my need to be validated and my need for reassurance that they value me and my expertise. If I'm going to work every day and I'm faced with someone who's really negative and really bleak and is even obstructive, then that's going to challenge my desire to remain hopeful and positive. And if someone's really oversensitive and touchy, it might challenge my need for authenticity in my work. Just like someone who seems selfish might be a real problem for me because I want to work with people who treat each other fairly. And someone who seems to micromanage me can really, tap into my sense of autonomy, professional autonomy, emotional autonomy. And this sense of being unpredictably and sometimes really demanding and needy can really challenge my sense of wanting a sense of balance. What do you make of this? Is it helpful? I mean, okay, I like the change of perspective, but for how long? A few more slides, that's all, Joe. A few more slides. Does this help? I mean, and again, I'm not saying it's all on you. You are the problem here. You're being completely unrealistic. I just think it helps to take a step back and think, what's really going on? Because I really think that it's just like there are going to be factors you can't change, there are going to be individuals that you can't change, but you can at least watch what's provoking a particular response from you. So let's take this one step further. Oh, and often what happens is we slip into really unhelpful language, compulsion language. You ought to do this, you should do this, you must do this. Barriers, it's impossible, it's hopeless. We speak in generalizations, don't we? This always happens, it's never going to work. Exclusions, that will just work, or it only is for this particular situation. We start labeling. Let's take it one step further. So here we have Fred and Mary, and you can replace those names in your head with whoever you like. And Fred would describe himself as a very consistent practitioner. That's one of the things he prides himself on. And actually, if I was asked to ask him to tell me a bit more about how he sees himself in the workplace, these are some of the things he'd come up with. He's reliable, he's precise, he's consistent, he's responsible. As opposed to Mary, if I asked her to describe herself in her work, she would say, well, one of my strengths is I'm flexible and I'm versatile and I'm spontaneous and I'm someone who's approachable. People come talk to me if they need a kind of open response. If I was to ask Mary about Fred, then she may well say this. She would see him as bureaucratic, as rigid, as patronizing when he was being responsible. And in terms of being dependable, well, he's actually pretty predictable and unimaginative. And equally, if I was to ask Fred about Mary, then I might get a completely different story in terms of her being totally disorganized. She's just random, she's very erratic, and she's unreliable. Now, why am I sharing you this slide? I'm sharing you this slide to say that one activity that you may or may not want to do, but I know from experience can be very helpful, is you think about the Fred or Mary in your workplace, a person that you find most challenging to work with, and force yourself to look at them through a completely different lens. List how you think they would describe themselves. So just as Fred did, how do you think they see themselves? Even if you find it painful to do it, try it. And then, and this can be really challenging, after you've listed all the good elements about you think, force yourself to be your own devil's advocate and think, well, maybe what am I giving out that someone like Fred is picking up, which isn't the way I expect to be seen? And I'm not suggesting that that will make your work-life balance perfect and you'll skip into work every day, but what I'm trying to do is to get you to think again about this is as much about falling into a pattern. Response to stress is patterned. And sometimes being able to take a step back and think, maybe I'm showing up in a different way than I think I am, can just help nudge things in a slightly more positive direction. And I can see some people have found this helpful. I'm sure that many of you are thinking, yeah, well, that's easy to say. Life is more colourful with rose-tinted specs on CB. Absolutely, isn't it just? And I'm not suggesting you lose those specs for one moment. I'd hardly suggest that with this crowd. But I just think it's important. I just think it's really important to bear this in mind. Okie dokie. I'm aware of time. Hopefully you're finding this helpful so far. Right. So you've kind of answered this already, but how might you use the information to better cope with a difficult person at work? Can you already see a shift in maybe the way you're thinking about someone? Or, and I want you to be honest, if you're thinking, nah, sorry, it doesn't work for me, that person I work with is just beyond the pale. They've always been a complete nightmare. They're always going to be a complete nightmare. I'm not the only one who finds them a nightmare. How do you think you might use it? Excellent. That's good to know, Awkward Ninja. Thank you. Yeah, I think this idea of psychoanalyzing is a good point, and I'm grateful that someone's thought about it. I'm not suggesting that you just need to, lay your various colleagues on couches and talk about, whether or not they like their father. I'm trying to get you to think about there is a view here that we lose sight of some of the issues that we're facing. And it can just be, no one needs to know you've done this. I mean, I have seen it used in a very rarely in a kind of team setting, but it has to be a team that, is really trusts each other and knows each other very well, because you can imagine how it can kind of massively backfire. I think it's much better as an individual activity, as something you get kind of internalize, and actually writing it down can really help, as opposed to just thinking about it. Yeah, try to understand where they're coming from, Kathy, and how they see me. Exactly. Okay, right. Last few things. I love a good fishy acronym. So here is the CARP of constructive coping. This is linked to some extent with assertiveness, and this isn't a session on assertiveness, but I think there is an overlap here, because sometimes I've found working with clients over the years that what makes people really stressed is they know what they need to do, but they don't feel able to do it. That's what's difficult. They know the difficult conversation they need to have, but many completely understandable factors, they're anxious about having that conversation, particularly if they think, oh, they've got to have it with someone who could have a really detrimental impact on the way they work, maybe an unconsciously detrimental impact, but nevertheless. So anyway, the first thing is control yourself and your situation. And I would say the kind of activity we were just looking at is part of that. And some of the things we've done earlier tonight, identifying, well, what's the really going on? What messages am I telling myself that's making this work? Taking a step back. And it's really, really important to do that. And another thing, and hopefully this links to where we started as well, acknowledging the emotions and the impact. This sense of how upset you are about things. Some of you have talked about, feeling dreadful going into work, feeling terrible at the end of the day, and giving yourself space to come to terms with that. And, in whatever way that manifests, I think is really important. And even when you're talking about this with other people, saying, this situation is causing me to be anxious about my job, and you're not getting the most out of me as a professional because this is really getting in the way of me doing my job. So you acknowledge the emotion without allowing it to kind of spill over. And then refocusing on the problem to the solution. So, so refocusing from the actual problem itself to the solution. So saying, well, what are we going to do? What can we do together to make this better? And looking for win-win outcomes, looking for something that is going to be helpful to the team that you work in and also helpful to your own kind of context in which you work. As I said at the beginning, to not say anything about time management, I think in a session like this would be really a miss, because, I find in my own work managing time is stressful, because if you have something to deliver in a particular amount of time, and you're aware that if you don't, then you are going to let them down and let the list of people waiting outside down as well, then it is stressful. But if we think about some of the things that we don't have control over, one of the very few things in our lives we absolutely have no control over whatsoever is time. An hour is an hour is an hour. So we therefore need to think about all the other things that we weave around that time that maybe we do have a bit more control over. Our behavior, our resources, the amount of energy we put into things, our environment. And again, I'm not suggesting that you have a huge amount of, control over the settings in which you work, but it may be that just small differences to the way that you deliver the practice that you do could make a difference. Motivation, and I think this is what I'm saying about reconnecting with why you're in this job is really important. Expectation manager. Stephen says, I think I need to change my job title to expectation manager. Yeah, I think that's so true, isn't it? So much of the work that we do is about scene setting. So getting a sense of what people think they're going to get and what they're actually going to get. And emotion management, thinking how you're managing your own emotions. What are you doing to support yourself beyond your work? This sense of your to-do list, you're probably familiar with this, thinking about, if you had to divide your to-do list into things that are important and urgent, then there are some things that are urgent but may not be as important as other things. So just trying to recalibrate. If it feels like you've got a wave of tasks coming towards you, trying to kind of think about how you might divide them into different piles, so to speak. And some people can find this helpful. The other thing I want to say is something about procrastination. And I think there's a sense of, procrastination, putting something off. And it may be what you're putting off is a conversation about how stressed you are with other people at work, or a discussion with your line manager where you sit down and say, these are the pressure points for me. This is what I need to think about. This is how we all need to work more effectively. Else, I'm not going to be able to stay in this particular context. And sometimes it's thinking, well, why haven't we had that conversation? Or why haven't we reached out for some support or help already? What are we avoiding? Are we avoiding the boredom of dealing with it? Is it fear of coming up as imperfection? Is it embarrassment? Is it fear of failure? Is it fear of success? Is it a fear that if you have a conversation, they make changes, then you're going to have to really think, well, am I committed to this position or am I not? What are your emotions saying? Take a step back, and like I say, and I don't want to sound like a stuck record on this, but I do think it's really important. I've even worked with clients who've written about themselves in the third person, saying, Mary or John decided to train as an optometrist because, and to really get a sense of using a narrative technique to reconnect with why are they in the position that they're in? Why did you feel that this was the role that was right for you? And then I said at the beginning, didn't I, that, we've kind of looked at causes of stress. We've looked at the fact there's obviously a huge amount of overlap with many of you sharing similar tales of similar pressures, whether they're kind of commercially driven pressures, whether they're time pressures, whether they're pressures around the way you're treated and viewed by patients and managers. But I also now, towards the end, I want to talk about, well, okay, what are we going to do about this? How can we reconnect with well-being? This idea of what's sometimes described as sort of mental wealth rather than mental health. This idea of kind of activities you can get involved in. And the New Economic Foundation, which some of you might be familiar with already, did quite a lot of work into what they identified as 5 core ways of getting back to well-being. So counterbalancing, getting back to that green area in the middle of a balance between work and the rest of your life, a copable level of stress. And there are 5 ways with these ideas of connecting, learning, active, taking notice, and giving. And let me tell you a little bit about what they meant by some of this. So connecting with others. I mean, I would say that tonight, hopefully, has been an illustration of this, that you've connected with each other through this means of the webinar. But it's worth thinking, well, how many people could you talk to if you have problems at work? Who else is there that you can, share these experiences with in a supportive way? Then another way is thinking about being active, because, there's loads of data looking at how actually getting out and about and doing something else that's not in any way connected to our jobs can have a hugely positive effect on our well-being. So what simple ways are there of being more active that you could incorporate in your life? Keep learning. Now, keep learning can mean obviously many different things, but how could you use your brain in a way that is entirely separate from work? Because there's a sense that just delving into something else. I mean, whether that's just some sort of pastime you do on your commute, whether it's learning online. I mean, I've been involved in things like MOOCs, for example, where you can learn something like absolutely nothing to do with your work, but something else that really sort of stimulates a different part of your brain. Giving. How could you express generosity and gratitude more? Now, I'm not suggesting at an end of a busy shift you may not want to be particularly generous or grateful, but actually something that gets you involved in a different activity could just recalibrate that sense of this work doesn't have to dominate every aspect of my life. And take notice. This is about taking a moment to just stop and appreciate your surroundings. I would say that this is where a lot of the sort of mindfulness approach, meditation, all these elements of actually taking a step outside of your experience and thinking, I'm just going to watch what it feels like to be as opposed to do, human being rather than human doing. Join a choir, great. Some people are saying engross in technologies and let our surroundings pass us by. Yes. There's a debate about lunch. Try yoga. Yes, as a yoga teacher, I completely agree. Right. Okay. Exercise is hugely beneficial. You're absolutely right. Okay. Well, a couple of you have suggested this, but which of these might you explore in the future? Are there any here that you think I'm going to have a go at that? I'm going to join that choir, or a little bit of each. Great. That works for me as well. Sounds like we've got a few yoga recruits by the look of it. Fantastic. And start small, I suppose is what I'd say. Don't think, right, I'm going to sign up and be a kind of, volunteer at a local charity, and I'm going to sign up to that Pilates class, and I'm going to sign up for a classical education, music education MOOC. Tiny, tiny steps. Really important. Yeah, learning another language, just something that takes you out of yourself, can really help reset that balance. But again, it needs to be done in conjunction with tackling some of the issues in the workplace as well. I'm not suggesting that any of these is a quick fix. And yes, you're right, having young children does feel like a lesson pretty much every day. Amen to that. And then finally, in the last few minutes, remember what good looks like. This is actually quite important, I think, because sometimes when we're deep in stress in our jobs, it can feel like it's just a cacophony of rubbish, can't it? It can feel like, everything's going wrong. Nothing's what I thought it would be. And I think it's just worthwhile reminding ourselves of what good looks like. And this is looked at some Coates and Leakey looked at, people who are most satisfied at work. What what actually are the ingredients of those happy workplaces? And there's lots of things, but these are some of the kind of classics that come up. Obviously, the organizational culture is a big part of it. And it might be interesting to think, well, what is the culture of where you work at the moment? And is there any way I can kind of, change that? Feeling secure in your job is another factor. And, there's a big discussion around the fact that actually that's going to be an issue for many of us as we go forward, that employment security is changing on a kind of industrial, pardon the pun, scale anyway. But people who have got variety and challenge in their job, people who have skills available to cope with pressure. And if you think of the pressure points of your job, the responsibility of your work shows that the fact that you're in this job anyway illustrates that you have those abilities to cope with pressure in a way that many non-clinicians wouldn't be able to. That sense of having some autonomy and control and task discretion, being treated fairly, and that balance between putting in the effort but being rewarded for it. And that reward may not just be in terms of salary, but it may just be in the sense of actually people valuing you and getting a sense that your colleagues value you as well as your patients. That flexible working arrangements and strong workplace relationships. So yes, don't stop believing. This should be a musical cue, shouldn't it? But I'm just sharing this list, not to rub your nose in it, to say, well, obviously isn't what it looks like where you work, but these are the things that you need to remind yourself are possible and to gravitate towards. Okay, now, crucially, because I always think with all of this stuff, it's great if you've enjoyed the last hour sharing some thoughts with fellow professionals, but this is the kind of nitty-gritty of where we need to translate this into you actually making some changes. Because if you don't make any changes, then realistically, we could just all meet again in another year's time and have the same session. So what I want to try now is asking you, what changes are you actually going to make? Are you going to make them now, or are you going to make them later? How are you going to make them? What barriers might you face? And who can support you in that? Who do you need to negotiate with? Do you need to negotiate with anyone? Are you just negotiating with yourself? What will you lose? And what will you gain? And why is this important to you? And this is a different question to why you think it ought to be important to you. This is why is it really important to you? And that's what I'm saying about connecting back to what matters to you, what we describe as our kind of core career values. So just thinking about that, I can see a couple of you get tougher on diary management tomorrow. Great, Martin, go. Plain Jane, drop a day a week at work to spend more time on doing stuff on my own, doing new stuff. Brilliant. So adapting your kind of work program, if possible, to adapt some of this in. Okay. So I'm going to come back to asking you to tell me what you're going to do, but I just wanted to remind you what we've covered before you do that. So these are my kind of, I hate the phrase take home points, but I'm going to use it anyway. Take a step back to recognize your stress drivers. Ask yourself, what is really causing the problem here? So beyond saying I'm stressed, push yourself, be more specific. What specifically is going on? Know your triggers, and I'd say own your response patterns. And you might not necessarily be proud of some of the responses you make, but you need to accept that that's what's happening. Challenge these internal narratives and evaluate external factors. So again, when you've got that list of what's going on, then divide them into what can you control, what can you influence, and what can you accept, okay? Or begin to think about how you're going to accept. Reflect on what makes people difficult, what really makes them difficult, what might make you difficult at times. Manage your time, energy, and resources as effectively as you can by thinking about your well-being. And commit to making the necessary changes. I'm delighted to see that it looks like the optometrist version of Glee has been launched tonight, which would be a fantastic outcome. But yeah, sound as though various different ideas are coming up. So I'm now going to ask you one thing, and there's nearly 100 of you in this group. I'd love to think if we could get everyone to share it. I don't know whether they're going to, but one thing you're going to do as a result of this webinar, and even typing it into the chat box, is more likely, I would argue, to make it real. There's quite a lot of evidence that if you articulate something, then it's more likely that it comes true. I'm not sure about the data, but you get the idea. Delegate more. Look at how people see me. The beautiful trees, lovely. Breathe deeply. Yes, in all honesty, it's really important. Watching your breath, tiny little factors that could have a big impact on how you cope in the environment that you're in. So I can see lots of you are typing, analyze how difficult staff see themselves, how they see me. Yeah, take a breath, think about how I view others. I would do this bit, revise exactly why you became an optometrist. Look at the way I react. Print the PowerPoint and take time to think about the points raised. Great. Thanks, Holly. You're right. I mean, we've talked about quite a few things tonight. Yes, be thankful for what you have. Remember the good parts of the job and remind you why you're here in the first place. So that's good to hear. Lots of positive ideas coming up now. Okay, well, everyone, I just wanted to say thank you so much. I really hope you found it helpful. I mean, learning to manage stress in an hour is a tall order, and I salute all of you for being such a lovely and engaged group. Thank you very much. I hope you found it helpful. Find me on Twitter if you do such things. And also what I've got here is some additional support and materials. I hope that that would be useful. Okay, so Araz couldn't log in until the last 10 minutes. Tried logging in since 8, but oh, sorry, that's gone. If there were problems with the link, and apologies if there have been, then we have recorded this webinar, so you will be able to listen to the whole thing. And I'm sure that you'll be getting emails regarding to how you'll be able to access that. Yes, I am a careers coach. I am LK, and I hope that's some slightly apparent, but maybe not. But anyway, thank you very much, everyone. If there are any other questions, and best of luck with the choir, I will be buying the album. Don't you worry about that. And I'm aware that it's 9 o'clock, and you've got the rest of your evenings to look forward to. But very best of luck, and thank you for joining me. Night, night.